Hi guys, good morning. Just gonna give it a second to make sure that everything is okay. Uh, my name is Tony Leonard, and I'm gonna be giving a bit of a demo here in ZBrush Live. How to use or how to generate or use ZBrush to generate 2D line art. So taking it from ZBrush into Photoshop. And just wanted to make sure that everybody can hear me and see me. So feel free to enter the chat, give me a shout out, and let me know if things are broadcasting okay. Hello, hey Kyle. I'm just gonna give it just 1 second to make sure that everything is dialed in and you guys can hear me. Oh, great, wonderful. Sorry, unfortunately, folks, I couldn't set up my webcam in time, so you just have me voice only today. But I'm really excited to kind of get started with ZBrush Live and present to you guys. So here's to a first inaugural stream and hopefully some cool ones afterwards. So I guess I should talk about myself a little bit, introduce myself. I'm based out of Los Angeles, California, and I've worked in comics, and I've also worked as a concept designer. And so I guess a lot of my speciality seems to be within generating 2D assets and now 3D assets since my time with ZBrush. I'm former to Game Republic Japan, where I worked on a AAA title for Bandai Namco known as Knight's Contract a few years back. And since then, I've also done some work for Heavy Metal Magazine and a few other clients freelance. And I work as a freelance illustrator here in Los Angeles. So thank you for joining me in, and thanks to everybody at Pixelogic. It's great to be involved in things today. Okay, so if you are ever interested, you can catch me on ArtStation, and probably finding me as Tony Leonard. And I also use my other studio moniker, which is Tonikoro Studios. That's Tonikoro. If you were to do a search, and I go by the same moniker on Instagram, where I run a sort of almost semi-daily art blog, just life, drawing, sculpting, kit bashing, some ZBrush stuff, 3D stuff. A lot of my 2D illustrations I post here to give you a sort of sense of the kind of work that I do. So I dabble with things between sort of like a traditional hand-drawn illustration and sometimes generating things on a CG side to use as a hand-drawn source. And that is where part of our conversation today begins. Trying to use ZBrush to generate some 2D line art. So I'm going to go over to ZBrush and just quickly go over something that's kind of a fun little concept mesh that I'm working on. And I guess a little bit about this one. I took some captures of it that I'm going to probably try to post later and show you guys, but I figured for today it would work as a good source to try out a few things. And for those that are pretty versed within ZBrush, this is basically a sculpt that was, for the figure at least, generated from just using like Z-spheres and sculpting from the ground up, right? And then when I wanted to check some of the anatomy, I used another mesh, just like a base mesh that has everything laid out with more, I guess, sound proportions for anatomy, and I just adjusted my mesh to match some of those proportions, and I think I might have exaggerated a few, maybe made some of the torso and legs a little bit longer than I guess the proportions would have allowed for as a stylistic choice. But some interesting things. I took some, I guess, Boolean pieces to try to generate some hard surface parts. And then I'm also using a few small little pieces of kit bash pieces, and using insert multi-meshes, and probably later on I'm going to get into how I did something like this, and using booleans, also using a pin Z-spheres to generate some topology and extra parts, and then I use also the Z modeler to edit some of those parts, so that I can get them going and get them placed. Also within ZBrush 4R8, as everybody is probably familiar with the new transpose and transpose widget, I guess, world space widget that's been built into ZBrush. I use those to do a lot of tweaks and edits of just parts that I actually apply, whether they be kit bashes. And I use my own kit bash pieces a lot, where I try to take and generate like something like a hand, or reactive armor pieces. And so this is actually just sort of like a mock of the arms. I'm actually going to come through and do them again later. But here's the thing, there's two different ways of generating line art for this. So if I wanted to use this in an illustration, say after I finish modeling it, this is still sort of a place in the middle where I still have a lot of work to do as far as fleshing out the concept. But to use as an example, I use the KeyShot bridge over to KeyShot from ZBrush as a source a lot. And so when I take it there, I'm not sure if everyone is familiar, but there are certain shaders and materials that you can apply to the model to give it a sort of Toon shaded look, where you can adjust some of the line art as it's rendered out from the shader. Otherwise, I think it might have to take a little bit of searching, but I have in the material, I'm not sure if I have it loaded up, but I should try to find it. Actually, I think I need to find it and load it up. But I actually created a shader that was a tri-shader in the beginning, and used it to basically go through and set up some line art. And so, when you look at your render tab and you have your material placed, you can use something. In fact, in a previous demo, I illustrated sort of like a 2D line art workflow. And at the time, I created a BPR, and out of that BPR, a lot of it came down to using some of the render properties and the material, and I copied a shader that looks exactly like comic book line art. I think today what I'm going to try to do is go ahead and maybe do a render in KeyShot really quickly. So I'm actually going to skip over here to KeyShot, and I guess I'll do this as an example first, and then I'll do maybe a little bit of sketching in ZBrush, and do some just like sort of like crazy, just a quick base mesh, and show you how much and how easy it is to translate some of this stuff over to a ZBrush file. So I'm going to go ahead and just unpause this, and I'm actually going to open up a new render, because this one I have going actually has other materials on it for a more realistic photo, more environment affected render. So I'm going to go ahead and just save this, and so I have a blank slate here in KeyShot. And using the KeyShot bridge, I should get a result that is close to something like this. Now here's an example of something that I'm not actually going to talk about too much because it's forthcoming, but I used the same method that I'm going to show you guys to make a base mesh in ZBrush. And then I used the Toon shaders inside of KeyShot to apply line art, and then I adjusted the weights of the line art, and I think some of the contours. And as it thickens up, I take it and I do a render of it. So afterwards, after that render, what I do is I use Photoshop to separate the line art, and then be able to do color, or in some cases, like in comic book art, I use black and white line art a lot. So I have a screen tone template that I generated for myself that I like to use for dot shaded material. And or there's the hand-drawn option where I can take a lot of this line art that I get from ZBrush and KeyShot, make a render, and then from that I can actually print out this line art to board, and then I can, from that printout, I'm going to be able to, hand draw over it using this basically as, say, like comic book pencils, and then I can re-digitize it by scanning it, bring it back into Photoshop, and then I can run the gambit on it any way that I want to. I can separate the line art out, and pretty much when I do a separation, here's the key thing about something like this, especially with Photoshop, is that I can separate things down to the channel. So a lot of times I use quick masking to channel and mask out certain objects. There might be a few pieces there missing in that mask, but always, you can go back and brush those areas in. But when I do a separation, all of the line art becomes masked out like so. And it's kind of probably hard to see, but the mask itself looks like a ruby lith. If you're familiar, back in the old days of pre-press, a lot of things for masking were masked out with sort of a ruby color, but all that should be left is basically the line art, and then you can just use that as a selection. So sometimes like the channel palette, and bringing this down here and making it a selection, and then I can just fill it to a transparent layer. So basically in layers I have a line art and a line art copy, so basically these are both fills of that line art from the work, and then it becomes sort of an option. So I always tell people, when you do something like this, think of the end result of what you want to get. So like if you're doing just needing it for a line source, and then you're going to do a paint over of it, or if you're going to paint under the line art, like sort of more flats comic style, you can do that. But most important is a lot of the line art source and the masking of, right? So let's go back, and I'll go back to ZBrush, and I'll just take this, and what I've got here is a minimal amount of like subtools, right? So just parts for the neck, sort of like clavicle clamps, braces, and these arms here. And whatever you want to have a different material, generally I like to separate things out. So there again is where transpose and also that widget come in handy. Like let's say, for example, if you want to hit W on the keyboard, hit Y, and then I think hold Control and mask certain areas out. So anything that has like an individual polygroup where you click, it's going to apply a mask, right? And this also helps for posing this out, but I actually want to keep this a little bit open and stiff so that I can keep sculpting on it. But of course, if you can invert that mask, and then just draw out, hit X, move your model around. Whoop, that's going to be a little funky. I still have the legs. I still have the legs selected there. But of course, you can move these and pose these out at will. And of course, you can use probably the world space widget to do much about the same. Alright? So for now, what I want to just do is go ahead, and since I have everything split up into subtools that I want, I'm just going to go ahead and hit BPR. But before that, you want to check your external renderer and make sure you have KeyShot checked. Whether you do things like painting on materials onto your model, you can also separate and group by materials. But for now, I'm just going to get each subtool as an individual piece into KeyShot, so I'm going to go ahead and hit BPR. Right. And if I flip over to KeyShot, it should be importing that model. So an interesting thing with this, I'm just going to do a few setup things beforehand. I don't want to go off too much on KeyShot, but you can adjust your model into view. And here's the thing, actually, I'm going to take and hide this piece, because for realistic more, you know, like a photoreal render. A lot of times what I do in KeyShot is I'll set up small objects to be light sources or like emissives. But with this, we're going to not have any serious lighting information. So this object, I'm actually going to uncheck the Scene tab and get rid of it. I'm also going to go over to Environment, and I'm going to hit a color, so just a blank white. So what we should have is just the base of our base mesh and model here, and then no lighting environment, just color, right? And over on the materials, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and just hit it with Toon shade, and you can search for this. And these are pretty much just regular default materials that are built into KeyShot. It doesn't take anything special, but you can just grab a color. I'll do Toon outline black. Find it. Yep, there we go. So we can see how everything is going to be affected. So I'm just going to put 1 at its default on the main body, and then I'm going to tweak that one, and then I'm going to show you how to apply it to the rest of it. So what I'll do is I'll come over to my material, or I can right click here and just edit material. I'm going to change up just a few things with the contour angle, width, and quality. So when I crank up my quality, maybe 3 or 4, and switch up my width. And I believe when you change the angle, here's the interesting thing. The angle usually seems to be set a little bit higher by default, but if you lower it, you pick up some more of the sculpt detail in the model. So usually I go just kind of eyeball it and see how much information I'm getting and see how clean I get it. So if I don't have any exact settings that I would normally tell anyone, it's just, you know, use these sliders between angle, width, and quality. I think that picks up most of the detail, most of the production lines and cut lines in the object. And then as far as width, I'll change the width down and make it a little finer. So maybe, let's say 0.92 maybe might be clean enough. And interestingly enough, some of this line art is going to actually change a bit in its look. Like, let's say if you put this into Photoshop, a lot of times what I do is I try to knock out all of the gray pixels, which is sort of like a grayscale seems to be sometimes like a problem for pre-press. And so a lot of times what I'll do is I'll go ahead and run tolerances and smooth out some of the lines so that it's an actual visual step, but I'm going to get to that in Photoshop in just a minute. So now that I have something that I could kind of work with as far as line art, I'm just going to go ahead, right click, copy the material, and on these other subtools I'm just going to go ahead and paste the material or paste linked material. So that way I can just go ahead and use the same material and it'll be global. To the rest of the model. I'm just going to paste link material here. Here there's like a little small piece that's like a neck cowl, so paste link material. And again, I'm trying to keep a side eye on the chat, so if you guys have any questions, please let me know. I'd be more than willing to answer. So paste material. Paste link material here. And paste link material here. I think that's most of everything. Oh, one more piece. One small piece here. Paste link material here. Okay, so I think I've got everything. There's not really anything on the back, so I got the hands. And she's got like big mech hands. A lot of the shape of this I'm actually going to probably redo the entire shape so that it looks like an extended arm long. And same for the legs. I'm going to actually chop these off and do mech legs. And also, one thing I forgot here, on the environment, I'm going to turn off ground shadows. So that way we have no gray pixels, right? So if I frame this up, get a shot like I like, let's say previously the I had it turned this way. Got enough detail in there. Alright, that looks good. So what I can do now is go ahead and get myself a render. And on outputs, I'll just set like a preset that's close to 1080, 1920, do that. And so the print size, the actual print size would be something like this, but of course you can dial these in and set it to whatever DPI and custom size that you want. I don't really need a lot of passes, but I'll just go ahead and say render all passes, and I think all layers. I'm going to set the name for this. So, okay, and I like to do a timed, usually a timed sort of render, but you can set the quality of it, so like maximum samples. I usually use maximum time, and to give myself because we're doing a stream here, I don't want to make you guys watch this for a horrible long time, so I'm going to set this just actually maybe low. We'll do a minute. Let's see. Usually 5 minutes or something would give me a measure of quality, but I guess when it's rendering, I can take some questions if anybody has any. And let's just go to the output and make sure that I save this. Let's see. There we go. Whoops, sorry. There we go. So I've got the destination for the file set, and this is pretty much what I'm going to get on the other side. Okay, so that's while that's rendering. It'll probably just take 1 minute to render out. Alright, so while that's going, you guys have any questions? Feel free to enter the chat, hit me up. If I was going too fast, please do tell me to slow down, and I'll try to go through and explain things. '62, '63. It's going pretty quick. Almost there at 80. Just to check, you guys can hear me okay? All of the visuals, the screen looks okay? Alright, so now we have our render. Just a quick, down and dirty, fast render. Okay, so I'm going to pop over to Photoshop, and I'm going to hide this guy. Oop. Out of the way. And I'm going to go ahead and open up previous render that we got done just now. Docket. So this is what we got. So pretty decent. In fact, I could probably like duplicate this or fill it, and it might thicken it up. Some of the lines look a little thin on the outside, but as a line art source, this is actually not too bad. And of course, if you hit Alt, you check your resolution. Came out at the resolution that we wanted. 3 channels. It's actually RGB. We're going to switch that over. And the resolution is actually 72 DPI. I'm not sure how that happened, but okay, we can fix this. So I'm just going to go ahead and do like a quick image size and get this up. Keep it at 100%, but boost it to 300. So 300 is about average line screen or DPI resolution that I use, just for about anything, especially when it has to be like print ready. And usually end files don't end up being so large. Sometimes in the case of color, they get a little bit larger, but for black and white line art, this could actually work. So I'll go ahead and just bump it up. Normally I would have probably kicked out a render that's about 300 dpi or 350, sometimes maybe up to 4. But beyond that, the human eye is probably not going to notice such details in print. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and hit OK. It's going to size it up. And this is where we get to do some really interesting things in Photoshop, beyond normal building and sculpting in ZBrush. But you could just do something like, sketching on a piece of Dynamesh clay. You dig into it with I use the Damien standard, almost like a pencil a lot. And so I mark out some cut lines, sometimes even without using any type of lazy mouse settings, but just kind of sketching on the clay, building definitions and shapes. And a lot of those come out really clean here. You could also use Photoshop or Painter, or even hand-drawn. Like this, after I separate it, I can, like I mentioned before, I can print this out. And if I have it in a layout, I can actually print it at about 16% opacity on a layer. To Bristolboard, or usually, like a lot of times I draw manga, so I print them out to like a B4 size paper. And then for those that don't know, B4 is like a metric size, international paper size, and it just sits a little bit around 10 by 15 in a comic ratio. So I can take this, or even if you're using something like, if you're a comics person and you're using Clip Studio, you can use sources like this to generate line art and then bring it in as a TIFF or an image and start drawing over it, or as is, so it doesn't matter. First thing that I'm going to do now that I've got this to size is probably I'm going to take it, go to the mode and flip it from RGB to grayscale, right? So that means that all of the color information of this is now gone, and I can go over to my channels and I should have one singular gray channel, right? Now if I was to separate this line art by hand, that might be a little bit time consuming, but I'll show you just a neat trick. With the gray scale, I actually have an action set up for this, and I'm going to try to speak with the good guys over at Pixelogic. So like if there's a page for this stream, I'll try to link it or put it up on a cloud for you guys, but I have a action set that I use. And in my actions, I have something that's called my Tonikoro Comics Cleaner, and this is an action that I've used for years to separate line art, even if it's done by hand and scanned, digitized through a scanner. And again, working from a 300 dpi line source, or maybe higher. But one of the first things I'm going to do is I'm going to hit this post scanning, and what it'll do is it'll run levels, curves, and run a threshold at about a level of 129. And this is the most important part, because what it's going to do, if I was to zoom in here, you notice that a lot of this information, it has gray pixels in it. Some of them are purely black, some of them are thicker, but really a lot of this is going to get knocked down just a little bit. So if I run it, it's going to clean up the image, right? So now I'm left with true bitmap styled stepped line art with no gray information. It takes only just like a split second to run it. And let's see here. Sorry about the pause. Okay, so I have stepped line art. Everything's a little blocked out. Here, I'll do this. And so now the image is a lot more cleaned up. And it's, for something that has like organic shapes, there's some organic contours here, and some that are like more mechanical lines. It's very, very clean, right? It's a very clean source. So the next thing I'm going to do, and I'm still working in grayscale mode, I'm going to keep it that way until I need to do anything like color, is go ahead and click on the line work masking separation for this. Now all that entails this, or all that is entailed inside of this action, is basically going down, making a selection, inverting that selection, The selection is made from, like, say, if I was to select all of this gray, and then what this action set will do is invert this and automatically set it as a line art on a transparent layer in Photoshop. So I'm just going to deselect everything and go from here and push play. And there, as you can see in the channels palette, it made a line mask automatically using quick masking. So if I was to turn this on, that is my mask around the line art. And then on the layers, I already have a line art layer set up, and I can pretty much do anything with it. Actually, let me turn the mask off so we're not confused here. So in between here, if I was to go and set up some new layers, like let's say I'll set up a group and a new layer here. Now, if you wanted to redraw this or do any type of other details to it, you can do that. Of course, anything that you draw and edit on here is probably not going to be the same type of bitmap or stepped line art as you see here. In other words, it will be without aliasing on screen. And this is kind of an efficient way for line art to print on printers when you don't have any, when it's not a grayscale. Let's say if you set it up as a TIFF, like a bitmap TIFF with a 50% threshold, the prints usually come out super clean when you go through ProofPress. And of course, what's cool about this is that you can use the channels to basically load them again. And if you were going to 4-color, you could just fill the same selection with your not exceeding more than 300% as far as ink coverage. I think I use something like 260, so you can actually get like a 260 CYMK coverage and just fill it when you're done. But working, usually if I'm doing something in color, I'll just flip over the mode to RGB and then convert it over to CYMK, making some edits, adjusting some of the colors, because sometimes you lose sort of like violets or any type of dark, like really light blues sometimes get affected by changing from RGB to CMYK. So I'm going to take something like this and show you what you can do with it. So I'm going to take here, and from a concept standpoint, yes, it probably could. In fact, a lot of times I draw onomatopoeias hand-drawn, and then I use a lot of the live tracing inside of Illustrator. So if you have something, I don't know how well it will work with the complexity with Illustrator. Creative Cloud is usually pretty good about smaller detail blends. But you could take this and probably bring it into Illustrator and do a live trace, like a live trace contour drawing, and it'll totally make vectors out of the whole entire thing, and then you could work with that. So I suppose yes, the answer is yes. You could most definitely use it with Illustrator. A lot of times what I do is, now that I've got this set up, I'll open up another file that I created. Give me just one sec. I have created these, which are custom tone kits. Much like Japanese manga, where you have dot screen shading and different screen shades, like line screen shades. Let me get the other one. The other one's a bit of a big file. Sorry about the wait. ZBrush. Sorry, I forgot to mention or answer your question. I actually had to scroll back up and look. A lot of my inspirations, I pull heavily from Japanese manga, comics, cult films at times, music, all kinds of things. As far as inspirationally speaking, and some things, a lot of things are inspired also by travel. Like for example, I myself, I lived in Japan for 10 years, and that was an adventure. So I suppose a lot of those influences have stuck with me over time. But back to what I was doing here. If I was to zoom in very closely, you can see that in the same way I've created a template of dot screen shades that have the same type of bit mapping, right? So if I zoom all the way in, that's 3200%. Each one of these pixels is camera ready dot shades, right? And each of these is separated in the template that I've made to a specific 300 dpi line screen. So 300 dpi, it's a 32.5 line screen per inch, and I have these at different percentages. So like, let's say I have down to 5%, and you can see that the thickness of the shade. Here, I'll just dock my actions there out of the way. Now I'll pluck out the layers. There we go. So in this group here, 300 dpi, 32.5 line screen per inch, and I'll hide that. And let's say if I start using a 20% line screen at that value, then what I'll do is I'll just dock this over on this side in Photoshop. And what I can do, this is before size as far as the document size, but what I'll do is I'll come over here and I'll just take my vignette tool, hitting V, and drag and drop it right over our file. So this might be, depending on the resolution, this might be quite light and quite small, but you could do something like this, where you just overlay it. Hit F so I can full screen this, right? And I'll go ahead and apply a layer mask to this. So I'll click here, and then I'll go ahead and just fill it with black. Oops. Yeah, there we go. So right now it looks like there's nothing much there. And in fact, my foreground and background color are just solid black and white. I'm going to go ahead and put black as the foreground. I'm going to get a brush. So right click or control click and get the brushes out. And I'm just going to start with a hard round pressure size. Sometimes I tweak it a little bit into a sort of a tilted oval shape. Doesn't really matter. Maybe customize the brush just a tiny bit. So I'm going to set my shape dynamics just about medium. And what I can do now is, if I'm on this layer mask, I have my pattern intact on the actual layer, but the mask is maxed everything out. And so this is sort of a non-destructive workflow on the line art. So what I can do is I can come through, let me actually grab, before I show you this, let me actually grab a couple of different patterns to put on here. So I'm going to do the same with 20, and I think I'll add something a little bit thicker, like 40. I'll drag and drop that over here, full screen it, step back. So that one provides a nice second shade. So I can just place this anywhere, generally over the model. The original line art, I think probably maybe I want to use it on the arms. I'll set it. Whatever you do, you don't want to try to rotate this line screen or size it, because if you do, you could end up with a possible moire. Getting a moire pattern and maybe plug up a press if you're doing print work. So just I would probably use it at size at 300 dpi, but on this layer again, I'm just going to go ahead and add a layer mask, and I'm going to fill it. Oops, there we go. So it looks like there's nothing there, but if you can actually see the thumbnail in there, you can see the outline of the shades there. So again, I'm going to just grab a brush, size it up, go back up here, and on these layers, I'm just going to name this group. Screen tone. And now I can have fun and sit back. There we go. And just go ahead and brush this in. For some reason, I think I got my colors mixed around. Sorry, having a little hiccup here. Should select the mask and then select the brush. The brush should be white. And for some reason, I'm not sure it's not working right. Should be in grayscale. Oh, there we go. We got a gray shade on there, so I do know that it works. This group just below. There should be a pattern here. So maybe possibly I did something wrong. Actually, let me start this once more. Let's get rid of that. And why did I do this? Because I have so much canvas space. I'll just go ahead and crop it. That'll work. So that's my line art. This is my tone. And again, just take this. And I'll grab the 40% and drag it over here. Place it. I'll put a line, or a layer mask, excuse me, on here. And then I'll go ahead and fill it so that it's black. And by the same rate, I should be able to just grab a brush. I'll take a much larger swath this time. It's actually putting the mask on, but for some reason I'm not sure if the resolution is off or something, but it's not showing me my mask. But either way, if you did this with a mask or if you didn't, you could actually even do it a different way. Let's see if that way works. So I can use the stamp tool. And this, if I size it down, hit Alt and grab a source, I can actually come back here and put the tone right over it. And of course, if I had a smaller brush, I could do it in a more fine space. So I'll do something like this. The layer mask way is generally how I do it. I'm not sure why it's not working correctly the way that I had it. Sorry about that. Ah, yes, that's possibly so. Yeah, I might have needed to reposition it. That's probably what happened. Thank you, actually. I was getting a little nervous and I wasn't paying attention. So something like that. And actually, let's go back to the layer mask and I'll try that out. Thanks again to whoever mentioned that, but you're probably very much right. So if I click on the mask and hit B, oh yes, gotta show it, of course. Select the mask and just brush it on. So yes, you're entirely right. I was doing it out of placement. So go ahead through and brush this in. And screen tone is so much fun to play with, especially if I'm doing hard surface design. I need to make this 100%, sorry, or else you're going to get some weird issues from the pressure. But we're just looking for solid black and white fill. Because anything lighter, if you say like change the opacity, what it's going to do is it's actually going to pick up the more light nature of that, and it's when you do a threshold in the end to set it up as a bitmap, it might like kick it down to a smaller size, like the actual dot size. Resner's Rage, thank you for that. Actually, you reminded me of something I wasn't paying attention to. So, there we go. Just gonna finish this 40% in the arm here. So I'm not going to do it too tight. I'm just going to actually do more of a rough brush over of this, and then I'm going to go around the edges and clean it up. Thank you, 8 cubed. Appreciate it. So probably next time around when I have a little bit more time to prep a model out, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some of these models and place them into a layout and show you guys further a few things that go from ZBrush into Photoshop as line art. And I can try some color as well as using halftone like this, but and I think I can probably try to provide you guys with my action set so that you can check out separating some of the line art. I mean, it's the easiest thing, and it's best to probably save it as an action so that you don't have to do it all the time. But doing it by hand each and every time you scan something or build a model and then convert it to line art and then have to set up quick masking and stuff, it can be a little bit of a pain. So an action actually helps. And the great thing is once you have all of this pattern set in, there's some sort of contrasting effects that you can do, like scraping the tone off, like you do with traditional screen tone for comics. Like years ago, probably in the States, or maybe in the, I guess, silver age of Marvel and whatnot, screen tone for artwork or like horror comics or something like that was probably a little simple, but an effective tool to increase the dramaticism behind a piece of art. And so they would cut what a lot of folks know as zipatone and then use a burnishing tool and actually apply it to physical artwork. Now in the digital age, of course, making something like this, I can use it as a mask, non-destructively brush it on, which doesn't affect the artwork. So there's two options that this could go. I could either do this for black and white presentation, or I could do this in color by just doing flats and then doing a paint over flats for a color file. So that there's really nothing that has to happen to the actual artwork. Like you can keep your artwork nice and tidy and clean without having to physically affect it too much. So now that I have something like this, here I'll go full screen. So I've got tone in on one arm, and then I could give it some depth by using an eraser tool. Let's say if I take something a little textured like chalk, squeeze it, turn it, get it a little smaller, and take over here, change that shape dynamic just a tad, and I can scrape away at the tone. And what it's actually doing, it's actually cutting away some of the dots so that I can sort of give it sort of a false specularity, I guess you would say. Boss. There we go. So if you have something complex like maybe props for an environment or something, and you wanted to use a 3D, a true 3D perspective, or maybe as a base to work from, this is actually a really cool way to do some really cool quick concepts as well as doing actual line art for comics. I think it could go either way. So I can put some small tiny highlights here. hold shift, and just go over one line a little bit. So if I click here and I hold shift and I click here, just give me a nice little edge, like a direct line edge. So now what we have here is we have a few things that are highlighted, and then of course we've got that tone piece that was at the neck up top. So what I can do is put my line art way back up here. I can take these guys where I'm working and I'll just go ahead and group them. I'll call that screen tone. Oops. There we go. There we go. So I've got my tone here and my line art here. So if I didn't want to mess with the line art at all, I'll just go ahead and select the layer and lock it. That way it won't be affected at all. And then I can just work out tone or color. So in the same vein, you could just make a new layer. And for this, I'm going to actually go ahead and just duplicate the file. So I'm going to show color information and black and white information, just ever so slightly different. Sorry about that. So I'll name this BW. Okay, so I have a black and white source. Put that over here. And I'll go over here to the other and change the mode over to RGB, sorry. And I won't flatten, so don't flatten. That way we keep our layers intact. And I'm just going to turn this guy off. And of course, now on my current layer, what I'm going to do is just go ahead and show you color. Like a cool gray. My color palette, usually I work with Copic markers a lot, so I have swatches that are actually Copic colors. I guess I could use something like that. And I can come through here and just do nice flats. And of course, if you wanted to, you can actually paint using a quick mask for something like this. Sorry for the banging sounds. My little peanuts are here at home with me while I work, and sometimes they come a knocking, so I'll have to excuse the noise there. So I'll just do this for the base. If I wanted to, I could just, use like a solid black and just draw a mask over the whole head and clean it up. I'm just going to be loosely putting in some flats here. Any of the overage outside of the line we can always erase and clean up. And actually, you know what? I'm going to select all on the line. Unlock it first. Select all on the line. I'm actually going to fill it with something a little bit darker. So on this corner here, it's probably closer to CYMK, but I'm just going to go ahead and do something like, I believe it's 60, 40, 40, and 100. So that way, 60, 40, 40, 100, 40 and 40 is 80, so 80 and 60, it's going to give you a coverage that's less than 300. So I think it's 260, so that'll be fine. And then just go ahead and fill it. And then we've got a print ready black layer that we can use on top of this, right? And again, if you change anything underneath, what I would do is I would probably draw it on a separate layer if you make edits, and then be able to merge the line art again and flatten it just in black and white. Run the same action set again where I did post scanning, where I did the levels, curves, and threshold here. And then, once you have that line art that's all continuously the same, sort of stepped bitmap type of line art, you can go ahead and do your work and then save it as a TIFF or what have you. So pretty much this is how you would be going with something with color. Like I can go ahead and just layer up colors and work in color on my color layer, which is actually underneath the line art. Or say for black and white, since we use screen tone here, I just want to very quickly show this where I can go and just change the mode, and I'll change it to bitmap. Actually, before I do that, let's do the same thing that we just did. So on the other. Actually flatten that out, but that's okay. So I go ahead and change the mode over to bitmap, and I'm going to pull this to my main screen here. Okay, so 300 will be my output, and the method will be use 50% threshold. And again, this has been flattened because I duplicated it, but again, we can separate this again, even after I put tone after it. So, excuse me. So now that I have this, you'll notice that everything is the same. In fact, all of the black, it's switched from sort of that grayish black to a darker one. And this is probably more of like a true or special black line fill. But there's my line art. Nice and clean, able to be used. I can edit this, or I can go back, and if I don't like the line art, I can go through the whole process and go back to my original ZBrush model, right? And when it prints really, really solid, really, really well, because the human eye actually doesn't pick up all of the stepping in the line art. Sorry guys, let me switch back over to my Twitch tab so I can see any questions that you have there. But yes, line art in ZBrush. So from whatever model that you had, let me go back here. So first, I'm just going to do a recap a little bit for a second here. So when I originally created this, I was starting to render materials with like more physically based rendered materials in KeyShot. Just some of the average materials that you might have. There's a few customs that I think I cooked up with material graph. But for this, I'm just using the straight up Toon shader. I think when I have the shader a little bit more organized, I'm going to talk about the one that I used beforehand. But yeah, in short, that's about it. So I took this ZBrush model. I went to my my external renderer, hitting KeyShot, exported that over using the ZBrush to KeyShot tools, got a line art source, cleaned up the line art and separated it, and then applied either color and or applied black and white screen shade. Right? And of course, you can take these, as someone asked me before, you can take this type of line art and use it in Illustrator if you'd like. I'm sure probably if you wanted to, you could probably even use this for animation, like line art animation, posing something and moving it, and then interstitially grabbing each image and coloring it like a cell and putting it into something like Premiere. It might work for motion. But a lot of times I do some like static imagery. So BKOST, yes, it is from a 3D capture. Not exactly a 3D capture like a scan or anything, but I sculpted up a model, and then I took that model into KeyShot and put the Toon shader over it. So again, if we go back to KeyShot, this is still my model, and I can still change those views and or edit my material, like if I want to go through and edit the material, or maybe change it with the material graph. I can do that. But pretty much there's only 3 key things in KeyShot that I'm messing with, and that's changing the background and the fill color of the material to white so that I can have a line art source, making sure that the render is at size and resolution. And then once I had a nice camera angle that I'm really hip to, like this is 38.5, generally I kick it up to like 80 or 88, so that depending on the perspective it might be a little bit more or less skewed. But the contour angle, so giving more or less detail to the contour of the actual shapes, changing the line width, thicker or smaller, and then the line art quality, which usually I make it about 4 or above, and comes out pretty nice for a lot of shapes. Indy Respawn, I'm reading your question. Random question, so when you were able to get the line art, you blend that in depth map. You possibly could do that. I've never toyed with anything like that because I usually deal with like flat, a little bit more flat line art. I don't do any like painterly strokes with the actual Toon shading, but it sounds like something that would be worth investigating if you could do it. But if I was doing a hand painted illustration and I was using, say, this line art source as a sort of motif to work in Photoshop, yes, you could probably work and paint on top of the model and under the model. So like I would separate the line art and do like fill colors to give myself a color scheme to work from, and then I would probably start painting, rendered painting, or like an overpainting over the model. Yeah. Sometimes when you this is kind of hard because I actually need to find where I saved my old shader for comics, and maybe I'll leave that for next time. But generally you can fill the model in ZBrush with a shader, and then I believe it's somewhere in the render properties, yes, 3D posterize. Depending on how you have this set, you can actually get a lot of line art from this with an actual material shader inside of ZBrush. I need to actually look at my old shader because I can't remember how I set it around the time that I did it the demo. But if you go back and you actually look through some of the demos that I previously did for Pixelogic, there was one specifically where I dealt with line art, and that shader I think I showed, it might be time-lapsed, but I think I showed where I adjusted some of these 3D posterized effects, and some of whatever, like say poly paint that you put on the model, it'll probably be like an individual color. So you could probably part it out, use the same shader, and then sort of give it sort of a painterly base, and then from that render take it into somewhere like Photoshop or Paint or your painting software of choice, and do other effects with it. Thank you guys so much. I think Kyle, are we at our time? As I see, it's 12 o'clock. Well, thanks again for joining me, everybody. I think we've hit the 12 o'clock hour. We've actually gone over a few minutes, so I don't want to take up anybody else's time with going over. But next time, I think I'm going to try a few other experiments with doing some comics, and I'll actually use something like this and maybe a few props, maybe some environment pieces, and tie them into a single page in a layout, and then we'll go from there and try either some time lapses maybe in color and the same type of placement with screen tone. But thanks again, guys. Very much appreciate it. Any last questions before we run out? Thank you. And of course, I'm sure through Pixelogic, you guys, if you want to send me any questions that I didn't get to answer, I'd be more than glad to answer them at my best capacity. Alrighty. Cheers, guys. Thanks again for joining me, and thanks for dialing into Pixelogic's Twitch channel. And it's been a pleasure. Thank you. Have a good day.